Hi folks, and thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar resource today. Before I begin the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which you are viewing this webinar and their elders past, present. As part of the Alliance, we like to also acknowledge our LGBTI elders because without their strength and courage, we wouldn't be able to be doing the work that we're doing here today. Today's webinar is going to be a brief introduction around making the most of the NDIS for LGBTI people that may be needing to access this. We're doing this in partnership with People with Disability Australia, and we've had some conversations with them around what might be the needs of LGBTI people, and so they're going to go through some information that they've come up with as well. So I'll just hand over to them, and it's Anne Penaluric and Mel Harrison from People with Disability.
Hi, my name is Mel and this is Anne, and we're here from People with Disability Australia, and we are an advocacy service, and we're here to talk about the NDIS, so the National Disability Insurance Scheme for the LGBTI community.
Hi, well, we've got a list of questions here which we've kind of worked through with the Alliance people. It's been a lot of fun and we've learned a lot. So we also thank the Health Alliance for their partnership and we really have enjoyed it so far, and I hope this will be useful to you to watch and listen to. We're going to start with some really basic questions, which of course anyone would like to know the answers for if they're listening about the NDIS, the new National Disability Insurance Scheme. So the first is, what is the NDIS? Why is it new and different?
So the NDIS is an insurance scheme for people with disability to enable people with disability to be able to be more independent in their house or in their residence and into the community. Essentially,
and employment.
And employment, yeah. Essentially, disability movement used to be in the medical model, which meant that people with disability, if they couldn't be cured or fixed, they would then be institutionalised. So these days, the disability movement is within the social model, and the social model enables people with disability to be able to access like things in the community because it's removing the barriers that's around people. So we do see people with disability as not being the problem, it's actually the environment that's around them. So if we remove all the barriers around for people with disability, they can actually live more fulfilling lives.
So what do you actually mean when you're talking about a barrier now?
So for instance, if somebody had a vision impairment and they wanted to access going to an education institution like TAFE, and for them to be able to do that, they needed particular software for them to be able to read their screen because they had limited vision, that the NDIS could actually buy the applications or the equipment or the software to put on their computer to enable them to read the screen.
Yep, great. So we've got the social model, and the social model is something that's actually built into the NDIS. And I think a really important thing to know about the NDIS that is new and different, and particularly as it does apply to people in LGBTIQ communities, is that it is actually a human rights orientated document. So I don't think anyone's going to sit around and read the NDIS Act for fun, although it is more entertaining than some other legal documents I've read. But it is really important to know that the NDIS is an instrument in Australia for recognising our obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it's actually been set up with really significant acknowledgement of human rights. That makes it quite a different document and a different act and a different set of operating guidelines than the sort of state government funded medical institutional services that have predated the NDIS. So it's a damn good thing, and it is really worth, if you have a disability, thinking about your potential to access the NDIS and how it might be useful to you. Okay, so
just to add to that, one
sorry.
of the things about the NDIS, it doesn't affect things like your disability support pension if you are on it. So, and it also means that it's not means tested. So if somebody has a disability and they are employed, they can still apply to get funding for the NDIS.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also complementary, so that you might get, for example, if you're a person with psychosocial disability, you might be having a healthcare plan. Under the healthcare plan, you might get some ATAPS counselling or some ongoing intervention in that kind of way. That can continue. You can still get your stuff under health. The NDIS is complementary, which also means it doesn't cover some things that you might like it to cover because it's not a whole of life scheme, but it is complementary to things that are already around. Okay, so I guess the next question really is the one about which disabilities is the NDIS for.
Yep.
Shall I read this one?
Oh, I can read it, can I? Or do you want to read it?
It suddenly went strange.
We're going on photos.
Oh. He's gone to sleep.
Hello.
Okay. Sorry, guys, we disappeared. Okay, I'll read it out for you. Which disabilities is the NDIS for? I'm going to read out what the NDIS actually says. The NDIS recognises all impairments that are attributable to one or more intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory or physical impairment, or to one or more impairments attributable to a psychiatric condition. So the first thing to note is that the NDIS does actually cover psychosocial disability or mental health issues, which often have been kind of relegated, I guess, to the health sector and haven't had much disability support previously. So this is a new and good thing about it. The NDIS recognises impairments in terms of funding that are likely to be permanent and that result in substantially reduced functional capacity, and this becomes really important, to undertake or psychosocial functioning in undertaking one or more of the following: communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care, self-management, and affect the capacity for social and economic participation. This kind of functional stuff is actually really important because it's again a change from what Mel mentioned is the medical model of disability, and it means that the funding that's available is available for a much wider range of supports than has previously been the case. But we just should mention before we move on that what's really also important for the NDIS is that it doesn't fund kind of everything in the world, and its emphasis is on people who have a significant and permanent functional impact. So a good example is if you have diabetes, you don't necessarily get an NDIS package. But if you have diabetes that's actually also resulted in you having vision impairment, the NDIS is there to provide supports for the vision impairment. So like Mel mentioned, a screen read. In fact, I know an absolute example of this where, great access has been provided for someone who has vision impairment for accessing study. So that it does that kind of support. Another example would be if you have bipolar disorder, for example, you don't automatically qualify for an NDIS package. But if the impact of your bipolar disorder is really significant, so you might have agoraphobia associated with it, or you might have difficulty in the ordinary aspects of daily living, then the NDIS might fund supports that wouldn't have been available previously. And that might include personal support workers or technological aids. There's heaps of other things that could be really, really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so how do you get onto the NDIS?
So getting onto the NDIS, people that are already accessing disability government-funded services or programs or supports will automatically get rolled onto the NDIS if they're under the age of 65. People that do not currently get the disability supports or funding supports, will have to actually apply for the NDIS.
And when you do apply, the NDIS has eligibility requirements, which, needless to say, you'd expect. First of all, you have to be an Australian citizen, or there's approved categories of residence. As Mel mentioned, you have to be under 65. Although if you start at 64, you can keep the NDIS after you're 65. And you have to show you have a permanent and significant disability. You do have to prove this. It is a bit like going for a job. It's like doing up your resume and all this kind of stuff. And you need to prove it with reports from people, educational, allied health kind of people, medical people, reports along those lines. And if you are going to apply, it's really important to get that stuff together and have it ready to go in with your application. Otherwise, it can take a really long time to get organised. But it is really important in that to remember that what you're applying for is funding for you as an individual. You're not applying for funding for some random service that will get money to look after you. This is funding. They're not going to hand you a pile of money, but it's funding that you can manage yourself, and it's funding where you can choose the services or the supports that would be really useful to you.
So it's quite exciting that people with disability get to make a bit more decisions about the services and resources that they can get.
And what about your chair? You can get different sorts of
chairs.
Yeah.
Or I can get new hearing aids to be able to communicate better.
I don't think you have any problems communicating.
No, probably not.
No. Okay, well, leave that one, everyone. Just leave that one. Okay. Well, what does the NDIS fund? We've started to cover that, and it's a really big question, and there's no one right answer, and we're certainly not here to tell you what the NDIS could fund for you, but we can tell you what it won't fund, and it won't fund things like that you would normally pay for yourself. So it won't pay for your food, won't pay for your rent, won't pay for a new tattoo, won't pay for a sex worker, and believe me, we get asked that one quite often.
However, if you need support or assistance to be able to get transport, to get to the place to get a tattoo, or to get to the place to access a sex worker, the NDIS might fund that. So it might fund the transport.
If not being able to get there is
the issue.
Consequent of your disability, of your disability.
Yeah.
So similarly, the NDIS won't buy your car, but it can fund adaptations so you can drive the car with the hand controls.
Or getting a lift onto the roof, the hoist, so you can put the wheelchair on the roof.
I thought you meant the car was going up on the roof.
Yeah.
Sorry, take no notice of us. Okay. Now we've got a set of questions that address some issues around the LGBTI communities, of which there are many, which we hope are really helpful for you. The first one was put to us was, how is the NDIS inclusive of LGBTI people?
So the NDIS is only interested in the functional impact that it has on the impairment of the disability. It does exclude people over 65 from entering the scheme, but otherwise
neither includes or
excludes or specifically includes people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, religion, and other aspects of diversity.
So that's getting back to the stuff that the NDIS is actually, in a sense, I mean, it's not technically, but in a sense, it's a human rights instrument, and it's very informed by human rights.
Yes. So it is inclusive of all people with disability, of all different diversity, if they're under the age of 65.
I'm a bit upset about the age thing myself, but anyway, we'll set that one aside. Okay, what challenges might LGBTI people with a disability experience when accessing the NDIS? I think it's really important to say at this point in time that the NDIS came in at the end of one government and was picked up by another government, and it was a bipartisan agreement, and really every government in Australia has been behind it. But it also, that meant that there was a lot of pressure to get it happening very quickly. And so at this stage, it is an evolving very complex scheme. So we can't answer that question kind of totally, other than to say that because it is new, it is big, it is evolving, it poses challenges for everyone. And probably the biggest challenge that we found and both Mel and I have been working around this area for some years now, probably the biggest challenge is that it's very digital. So the NDIS requires you to go online a lot. And so it really
or
does...
to read fine print on a written letter that is sent to you. So if you have a sensory impairment, that might necessarily be...
Yeah, they kind of forget to braille things and stuff like that. But it does actually, it does reside very much in a digital environment. So people with cognitive impairment, people who are deaf, blind, people in remote and rural communities probably have more challenges than virtually anyone else. And it does have human rights principles. So if there are challenges of attitude that people with LGBTI experience, then there's a lot of avenues of redress. And there's a lot of ways of just picking up people and saying, no, you can't do that. It just doesn't wash. Okay. But we would, really like to hear your feedback. PWD would like to hear your feedback if you do actually experience any difficulties in accessing it, particularly on the basis of being in the LGBTI community set.
And that's because PWD is a rights-based advocacy organisation.
Yep. Okay. All right. What about recognition of gender if different from legal documents, including Medicare documents?
So the NDIA tells us that they, like most, if not all, government agencies, will identify you formally as the gender noted on your legal documentation. But they say there is no reason you cannot tell them what your gender preference is when they're interacting with you.
Yes. But I have to say they've been really good about this issue. They've been quite sensitive to questions around it. So I think it's a kind of good kind of position in that way. And the same actually applies to the recognition of your name if it's different than that on your legal documents. They're quite clear, formally that's your name, but you can be known by any name you choose to be known by, and that's a perfectly, acceptable thing.
Yep, and just letting them know that.
Yep.
So they know how to address.
How to address you. So what pronouns, what name, that's it, it's fine. Cool. Okay, how about people with intersex variations? How are they considered?
So again, the important thing to the NDIS is the significant and permanent impact of any impairment or health condition. Under federal laws, since August in 2013, it has been unlawful to discriminate against a person on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status. These laws apply to the NDIS as well. Similarly, and I think I said that word wrong, people with intersex variations will have to show they meet eligibility requirements to use the NDIS, just as a person who identifies as female or male does.
Yeah, so there really shouldn't be any issues. We say shouldn't be.
So they're saying the NDIS is about human rights, so there shouldn't be any issues when it comes to
being human.
Okay,
recognition of same gender or trans partner who might be a carer. We've got a couple of questions around this one, and this is a really, really interesting issue. So that act we've just mentioned, which is the Sex Discrimination Amendment, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Status Act of 2013, is actually a really important act to know about. And it protects all couples from discrimination under the definition of marital or relationship status. And as the Human Rights Commission puts it, these new protections will particularly apply to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, gender diverse and intersex people. So the NDIS is bound by recognition and respect for those legal strictures, just as any other federal government agency is. But the NDIS is actually more conscious of its human rights position as well. So I think the outcome of this is this is okay. Mm-hmm. And certainly our experience to date, and we've done quite a lot of work in a variety of communities, is that same-gender partners and carers have been respected. And we know trans participants of the NDIS have not faced, or we know trans participants who haven't faced discrimination. We haven't actually had any reports either of anyone facing discrimination. We haven't actually had any experience with trans partners yet. If the NDIS or one of its agents did discriminate on the basis of same gender or trans partner, you can complain internally to the NDIS or directly to the Human Rights Commission. And actually, we've got a script, as you can tell, so we're reading it, but I'm going to actually skip, if you don't mind, mm-hmm. to question which we've got as number 13 here. And that's about, sorry, wrong one. I'm going to skip to question 14. What are the rights of non-birth parent of a child with a disability, so that is a child with a disability with LGBTI parents? Because this is kind of along the same lines. Well, I keep going with this one because I talked to the NDIA. Yeah. Look, I think there's a really good story here, and it's our thanks go to the LGBTI Alliance around this, because I've had quite a lot of interaction with the NDIA on this question, and really the answer in a sense is watch this space, because no one had asked them this before. And so their theory is they may have to develop a whole policy around this, which is actually really good that they've been pushed to think about it. At this stage, it's a question that's not addressed in the Act in the same way as there's no breakdown of a whole pile of diversities in the Act. But it can be noted that more than one person, so if you're a non-biological parent, you can still be a contact person on the NDIS for a child, and that means you will be considered and talked to in all of the correspondence and the decisions that are made. You don't have to be related to the child. And a person who's not a parent can actually be appointed as a financial manager of an NDIS package. So all NDIS packages are a package of money for the individual. Mm-hmm. For a child under 17, that package is automatically assumed to be monitored by the parent or parents. But we'll get to some kind of exceptions to this in a minute. But generally speaking, they will manage the funding for the child. For an older person, a person over 17, you can choose to manage or self-manage, which is something we'll mention in a minute. But it means that if you are the non-biological parent, you are still able to kind of be in there in terms of the package and the management of the package. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that to keep in mind is that there are other important acts, so like the Sexual Discrimination Amendment Act we mentioned above, the Disability Discrimination Act. There's a variety of legal protections here that are really useful. So now I've deviated to that one. We might go back, Mel, to access to LGBTI inclusive services.
Yep, especially in the rural and regional areas. So one of the great things about the NDIS is that it gives the individual choice over who provides services to them. All the services should be LGBTI inclusive by default. That is, they are legally required by various bits of government legislation to not discriminate against the LGBTI community. But in the real world, that is not always the case, or the experience of people in the LGBTI community.
But theoretically, the increase in individual choice in the NDIS. So in the NDIS, you get to choose which service provider you want to do something. So, for example, there's a woman who is a very early participant in the NDIS. She's a woman who's blind. She had personal support services, shopping support, that kind of stuff, through state government services, but they were only available 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and weren't necessarily people she was too keen on hanging out with. Under the NDIS, she's been able to choose to use the money for personal support for much more flexible arrangements, which have included things like learning to drive a golf cart, which is an interesting idea, but, that you can make some choices there, which also means then that you may choose to actually employ as your personal assistant. I've always wanted personal assistant, someone who's more sympathetic with your worldview, and certainly someone who's not in a kind of maybe religious community or something like that perhaps are choices we might not always make, but maybe we would in other circumstances. And theoretically that means that over time there should be more services which will actually advertise that they are LGBTI friendly, that there are more services that may be specifically dedicated or directed to particular communities. So
or people that are from the LGBTI community, they might know services that are
well, they
out
may
there,
become service providers, in the same way as you look at ACON or POSLife or any of those kinds of services which have become community specific. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Now, we were asked a tricky one about privacy, which is actually really simple, but it's always tricky at the same time. You want to tell them?
So privacy is, for the NDIS, is very much like other large organisations. It doesn't share information with other agencies except in particular circumstances. However, if you already receive state government funding support, some information might be shared, but that's allowed by the Privacy Commissioner or Commission.
But then when it comes to the harder bit, which is how is information shared with parents and carers, and what if parents aren't LGBTI supportive, this became another question that we thank the Alliance for, because the NDIA has spent a lot of time actually starting to deal with this. At this stage, it's a bit of a watch this space. They are hoping they will develop a policy around this to make it all a bit clearer, because it's also relevant to a whole pile of younger people in particular. At this point in time, a younger person, can request not to have a parent or guardian involved in their NDIS arrangements. A carer who's not a parent or guardian, so if you were living in resi, if you're in residential accommodation, for example, you might have a carer, that person should not be involved unless the individual requests or fully agrees to their involvement. And this is a really important principle of the NDIS. The NDIS is about you. It's about what you want to do with your life. It's not about the service actually dictating what you might do. So it's a really important part of the NDIS as it functions in the real world. But it is certainly an area that we've found with people, particularly people with dual sensory impairment. So in the deaf-blind community, we found that carers are taking control, basically. Yeah. But the NDIS is about your choice and control. It's not about a service provider taking it. So I guess it's sort of the message is you stick to your rights there again, because, particularly around the carers, because it protects people. If you won't have carers involved, it protects people from having other people make decisions for them. With respect to parents, a person can also exclude parents or guardians from the list of people that the NDIS can contact in relation to their funding. So you do have that choice. But having said that, the NDIS don't really have at this stage clear guidelines as to what age someone might choose to do any of this. We also asked the Federal Privacy Commission around this one, and they say that an adolescent would generally be considered to be able to make these kinds of decisions for themselves. So that under privacy, if you're 15, you pretty much have the right to actually decide that you don't want your parents involved. That would probably mean, in NDIS terms, that you would need to appoint, if you're under 17, a nominee, that is someone else who could make decisions with you, or in some cases on your behalf, but only with your
permission.
Agreement. You have to have a talk through of all of those kinds of things. Under Medicare and under health in Australia, the actual age of non-sharing is 14. So according to the NDIA, they think 14 would be about where they would cut it off as well. So if you're less than 14, you probably have more difficulty actually not sharing with your parents. But having said that, as the Privacy Commission points out, that the NDIS can't share with your parents that you are LGBTI if you say no. They can only share
the disability-related information.
Only the disability-related information. Okay, so I think, and that's really important to actually keep in mind. Okay, I think the other ones we're going to really have a look at now is how will LGBTI people know what NDIS services are LGBTI inclusive? What about accessing services that are targeted for a particular gender, women or men, or intersex only? Okay.
So I'll read this. The first thing to note is that the NDIS doesn't provide services.
Really important thing to note, it's not a service provider. It's a funding agent for the individual.
Yep, so it provides funding to individuals to purchase or contract other services. They can be disability-specific services, but the NDIS supports the use of non-disability-specific service providers as well. There are a list of service providers on the NDIS website. There is nothing to stop a service advertising that it is inclusive, and hopefully, like holiday accommodation or particular bars, organisations will think it's a good idea to be LGBTI inclusive. As well as that, if you self-manage your NDIS package, you can contract, or pay any legitimate service or individual, which means somebody that does have an ABN, and any business that does what it is that you have funding for. So then you can actually choose the LGBTI service that will help suit your needs and provide what you need for your needs. And I think that was a very convoluted way of saying that.
So it was a bit complicated. But we got there in the end. Okay. So the point that Mel's making here, and that I'm just going to draw out a bit more, is that, again, that the NDIS is about actually giving choice and control to the person with disability. It's a new scheme. It's a federal scheme. It's a scheme that funds the individual. It's not a scheme that just gives money to a service provider. So in New South Wales, you had ADDIC. It was well funded, and there's been some good things about it. We won't malign ADDIC, but it's a monolith, and it makes choices for people. In the same way that NGOs have been funded, and they just say, well, we want to provide this kind of service, so you can come along, and if you fit in, we might give you this kind of service. But it's always been a matter of people fitting in with the service, not having a service designed around them.
So it's also important to note that people with disability can access services that aren't disability related as such. So for one of the first times, they're able to be part of more mainstream service providers.
Absolutely. And so if you do want to think about applying for the NDIS, as we said earlier, if you're in a rollout area and you're already receiving state government funded disability services, you'll get a letter We do know people who are blind who've received letters, which has not been a terribly useful way of communicating in the post. And so you really need to remind people that you want them by email so you can read. But you will get a letter, and you will get a pretty much an automatic rollout if you're already on a level of state government services. Those with the highest level of service will be rolled out first, and those in particular geographic areas will be rolled out first, and that will go on. Once, if you are applying for the NDIS, it is really important to remember it is an individually funded service, and it's going to actually allow you a lot more choice and control. So as Mel just said, you can access mainstream services. So instead of actually being pigeonholed into, well, this is available and that's available, but really these are all about groups of people with disability going along and just kind of, I don't know, how do you describe it? Being made to be square pegs into round holes, or round pegs into square holes, and you get to have those individual choices. And there's a lot of stuff that is available under the NDIS that wasn't previously available for individuals. And particularly, I think we just mentioned the technology aspect. So if you do want to apply for the NDIS, you can get funding for what the NDIS calls core activities. That's activities of daily living. So that might be someone having shopping support that we were talking about before. You can also be funded for capacity activities. That might be, for example, if you want to access education, your educational institution will still be responsible for providing disability support when you're in the institution, but there are other supports that can be provided under the NDIS to allow you to access that, that TAFE or university or whatever. And then there's this really important one, which is capital. So there's core, there's capacity, and there's capital. And one of the great things about the NDIS is that it has a great big bit of funding there for technological supports. So what that really means, if you are one of the groups of people that I spend a bit of time hanging around with, are people living in the deaf-blind community. For people living with deaf-blindness, it's really difficult to be independent because there's not, it's not very, you can't hear someone knocking at your door. You don't actually hear if there's a fire alarm going off, just for two really basic examples. The NDIS has funding for technology that will enable that independence, so you can get devices that will actually alert devices, that vibrate devices, that will let you know when someone comes to the door or when an alarm's going off, that kind of thing. So there's some really terrific stuff that is available under the NDIS, which we really encourage you to think about. It applies to people of all ages under 65. We won't talk about age discrimination, as I said, but all ages under 65. And it does apply to all disabilities. Okay, so it's not about health condition, it's about all disabilities. So if you have a psychosocial disability or psychosocial health condition, it's the disabling impact of that will be addressed by the NDIS. Yep. Fair summary?
I think so.
Reasonable. Should we say a bit about complaints, just in case?
Yep. So if people needed to make a complaint, they can make an internal complaint via the NDIS website. And then if you don't think that the NDIS package you have approved meets the NDIS guidelines,
you speak up. You speak up. Yep.
And then that complaint might then go on to what is called an external merits review, which means it goes to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, who generally are a remarkable, pleasant and informal lot.
Yeah, they're really nice.
And you can also get some advocacy support through PWD, which is the organisation that Anne and I work for, and other organisations during your complaints process. You're also able to make complaints to the Australian Human Rights Commission if you believe they have been discriminating against you on the basis of your gender identity or sexual orientation. It's the same act as we mentioned earlier.
Okay, I think that's about us for now because we've probably said quite enough.
Yeah.
But we are going to have information available on the Mindout website and the PWDA website that you can kind of download, you can have a look at. And that will have links to both NDIS information or further NDIS information, advocacy information about us and about advocacy and why it's important for you, and also about some LGBTI specific supports that might be useful. I've also found a few international websites that have some pretty good stuff on that for around discussions of these areas. So I think that's probably about a wrap, guys.
See you later.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye. Sorry, I'll have to cut that off.